we
Welcome to another show of the Research to Reps Roundtable. I am your co-host, Dr. Pat Ivey, and with me are some of my friends. Dr. Ted Lambrinides, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Pat, and I'm going to swing it over to Ernie.
I'm doing good. Just got back from Australia. Got to learn a little bit from the Australian Strength and Conditioning Association, time of our lives. And we're here today with Mr. Lance Walker. Lance, how you doing?
I'm wonderful, guys. Great to see you guys. As you said, friends, man. Been friends a long time.
We shouldn't take up too much of this podcast calculating how long we've been friends, but it's been over a decade, approaching two, maybe.
Yeah, it has been. And Teddy as well. And I mean, Teddy's on the Mount Rushmore of this place, right? I mean, it's amazing to just get to spend some time with Teddy these days, you know?
I would agree with that. I would agree. Lance, tell our listeners a little bit about you in case they didn't hear the Beyond Sets and Reps podcast to learn about who you are. If they did not, encourage them to go listen to that podcast. This is Research to Reps. So we're going to get to know you, but we want to get to know what you know. And like you said earlier, or what you don't know yet.
Yeah, we could fill up a room with the ladder on that. But this is 30 years for me, man. I was doing the math the other day, and that's sad. I'm looking at myself in this silly Zoom thing, and I've got gray hairs in my beard. I got more hair growing out of my ears than I do on my head. I mean, I've turned into one of those guys, you know, one of those old guys. But 30 years of doing this, and I'm the idiot that decided I needed to be a little bit of a master of all trades. So it was physical therapy school, it was researcher, it was strength conditioning coach. Oh, now I need to be a strength coach at the high school level, and then the college level, and then the pro level. I need to learn about all that. So I did that. And I need to publish some research. So I need to live in a lab for a while. I did that. I need to go out and practice physical therapy to learn how to help people in physical. I'm that guy that just tried to do that. And for 30 years, I've been trying to mix and mash all that together to figure out this profession we call, whatever we call it today. I mean, I want to get into that too. What do we call ourselves? And I'm still trying to figure it out, man. And so that's what I've done. And where I'm at now, I'm at a wonderful Oklahoma State University, and they're actually hiring me to help them figure that out too, in a really big way, in an institute role that hopefully here in about a year's time, I'll be able to come back and tell you all about the great things that we're doing here. But it's a real blue sky opportunity for me to leverage that background and all those things to bring to bear to the consumer in this case, which is the athletes at Oklahoma State and the people of the state of Oklahoma. So I'm excited.
I love how you talked about the consumer, and you said it's the athletes and the people of Oklahoma. I would love to hear more about that, because a lot of times, you know, we think about who we're actually serving. And you said the consumer. I often think of it as the customer. So would you expound upon that statement you just made, that, you know, who your target audience or your target consumers may be?
Yeah. Well, I've learned that the hard way, right? That it's this profession we're in, it's not about us, right? It's about them. And we are in the service industry. And I spent 15 years at Michael Johnson Performance, where we were in the business of providing folks the opportunity to realize their full potential. Is kind of part of our mission statement was there. And they were paying us to do that. And that was very enlightening for me, because up to that point, I'd worked primarily in the collegiate ranks, high school ranks, even in the NFL for a cup of tea. And although I was serving in those roles, this was the first time that I was in a position where somebody was paying me to produce for them. And in that world, you know, as you guys know, if you don't produce for them, they'll go down the road and get it from somewhere else. And we had the nice location there in Dallas, Texas. The problem with that is there's, you know, probably 5 other facilities within a stone's throw of us that would do it what they thought was better or cheaper or quicker or whatever the promise of the day was. And so it was a very competitive environment. And the minute we didn't have the consumer, in that case, the athlete, whether that's a 6-year-old trying to get off the bench and kickball, or it's the 36-year-old, you know, that's trying to get into a major golf tournament. If we didn't produce a result for them, they left. I mean, it was fine, right? I mean, that's how you grew as a business, was to just be better and better and better, and always be better than those around you at a better price or a better ROI. So that word consumer, I guess, has kind of stuck with me. And I learned also that the minute you get that athlete or that person, that consumer out of the center of your circle and start trying to deliver to somebody else in there, that you get it all backwards, or at least I do. So that's why they're a consumer to me, and they are always right. The customer is always right. I mean, your athlete is always right. And that's an ego swallowing thing for me as an old coach. The coach is always right. No, the athlete's always right. I mean, and their perception is their reality in a lot of cases. And that's, you kind of got to crawl into that space and be comfortable with them being a consumer of your goods versus it being all about me. And it's, you get to benefit from it being all about me. And when you get that backwards in business, you go out of business. And I think we got that right for a lot of years. And I'm trying to carry that forward into my next chapter of my career. Tell me how, Pat, whenever you look at that, how do you keep yourself as a science, it's science and it's knowledge, it's creating new knowledge and innovation. And we get so enamored with that stuff sometimes. Do you ever find that you get that backwards? Like you get the athlete becomes like a research subject, or becomes sort of you never get it wrong. I mean, but do other people get it wrong? I know you're laughing. I mean, we all probably fall into that, right? But have you gotten it wrong before? Has that burned you? And how do you keep them in the center of this mix?
I have gotten it wrong before. And I think when you're trying to grow and you're trying to expand and you're trying to learn, you have to make mistakes. But there are certain mistakes you don't want to make. There are certain ones that are too costly to make. So I think learning how to make mistakes on a smaller scale, there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes mistiming when you're trying to peak your athletes, there's nothing wrong with that. Blowing out 10 hamstrings, there's a problem with that. So, if you try to, you're trying to time up your jump training, your explosiveness and your sprints and your volume, and you mistime it by a week or two. Okay, big deal. Or you don't quite get the results you wanted to have. Okay, you go back to the drawing board, but you hurt your athletes too far in the wrong direction. So and that's happened before as well. I remember doing sprints in the summertime and asking them to run 100% even at 20 or 30 yards was the wrong thing to do. And we learned, let's just ask for 90%. And it's amazing. We actually got what we wanted when we asked for 90%. And we got what we didn't want when we asked for 100%. And so but you have to learn. You have to learn, okay, that's not the right thing to do. They'll be nice and smooth with their mechanics at 90%. And that's what we need out of this drill. We don't need them overextending, overstriding, getting out of whack biomechanically, and pushing themselves to compete with the person next to them. Like, that was a learning experience. So did that answer?
Creating new knowledge. That's science, right? I mean, that's what you're basically creating new knowledge. It's on the consumer's dime though, in that case. And that's what always is a frustration, I think, for me in the science side of things, is sometimes, if they are a consumer, they should never be experimental subjects, right? Even though you're trying to find out what's the best, you don't want to sacrifice the risk of it not working on that consumer. And so that's why I asked the question. Sometimes it's a really hard balance, and sometimes it probably holds us back as practitioners. We know this works, and they're our consumer of our goods. We know this works. We're going to do this. We're not going to change for the sake of innovating to try to find a new way, because we're either afraid of doing some harm or not getting the benefit that we know. It's almost like, hey, instead of going after that 100%, we're going to make sure we're there 80% of the time with 80% of the athletes and getting 80% of the goodness, and just doing that consistently, which there's value in that. But does it limit us? I guess as a profession, does it limit us in our ability to innovate? And I'm going to challenge everybody listening right now. We are not innovating, people. Don't tell me we're innovating. Okay. Don't tell me we're innovating. Show me. And I'm having a hard time finding innovation right now in this space. And I'd say that to kind of stir some people up too. It's a little shock jockey there, but The concept is let's be more innovative, but how do you balance that with also doing what is best for the consumer that you know is best practice? And that's what they're, paying you with their time and honoring you with their trust to do. How do you balance that with the need to innovate?
Well, Lance, that's what interns and GAs are for.
Exactly.
But the one time you spoke, and I want you to expand upon this, and you talked about the importance of that athletes don't run as much as they used to, and how that's so important in terms of helping mitigate injuries. Could you expand upon that?
Yeah, it's the old school, new school part of balance in this question keeps coming back, and which tells me that maybe we don't have all the answers, and we don't have all the answers, right? We never will, but this concept I think that you're talking about came up around mitigating hamstrings. I think hamstring risk, keeps coming up. It's so funny, it's funny, it's sad. 100 years we haven't figured out the hamstring strain. It's like the common cold of strength conditioning. We're really geniuses, aren't we? I mean, we're amazing at what we do. We can't solve that problem. And I'm talking to all of us, right? But go all the way back old school for me. If I go way back in the annals of strength conditioning, when I cut my teeth on philosophies from Pete Martinelli and Joe Jurassic. Blair Prince was part of that lineage as well. And I go back to those early days. Jerry Palmieri was an example of this back in the day at Kansas State before he went on into the NFL. There was a concept of this conditioning piece of running things like repeat 300s and repeat 400s and repeat 200s that sort of, I think, was born out of the track community, maybe, that we need to condition this long to short. And then we bring that long, 300s and 200s become 200s, 110s, 40s, 60, down into that shorter zone. It's that true long to short approach to speed training. Well, they didn't call it speed training, right? They called it, that was conditioning. That was on the conditioning days. But what I found with those long to short approaches, it felt a lot like a build in strength conditioning where you would build from 10s down to your heavy doubles. It felt a lot about the same. It felt like we were doing the same things. We were building or crescendoing into those higher intensity things. Now, did the 10s in the weight room get me stronger? Well, they set the stage for me to get stronger, right? The same with some of that longer duration 300s and 200s set the stage for us to run those faster 40s and high intensity 30s and 20s. So that long to short concept, for some reason, I don't know, it got unsexy at some point. At some point, people got away from that. Like we don't do that anymore. We don't do track work anymore. And I think I fell into that, right? I fell into this, well, let's do the opposite. Let's do really short, acceleration only, and then extend that out. And I think some of the mock series, and I know Coach Hansen talks a lot about that and had some success with that, even on hamstring rehabilitation, is starting them, running 0 to 5 yards maximally, and then extending that, holding that speed from that 5-yard speed out to 40 yards. And then you go to 0 to 10, and whatever speed you get at 10, you hold that for your 40 to 60 yards. It's sort of a short to long approach to that. And I dabbled around in that too. And what I started to kind of find out was that I wasn't getting the volume. I say us, Michael Johnson Performance, and even some of the places I stopped over before taking that gig, we weren't getting the volume of true repetitions of the actual running, if you want to call it running. We just weren't getting the volume enough doing the short to long. And so we sort of adopted was a combination approach. We started to attack it from both ends. So we started attacking it from the long to short, and that built into our maximum velocity training. So you can imagine running those 300s and 200s and 100s and building that down volume wise, but increasing the intensity of those runs from intensive tempo all the way down into what ended up being fly-in sort of maximum velocity sprinting. But then on the flip side of that, we would also build from the bottom up. So we would build 0 to 3 yards, 0 to 5 yards, 0 to 10 yards. on the acceleration side of things. And so we would begin to blend those together, and ultimately we would end up fusing those in a 6 to sometimes 8, 12-week period of time into the meat of what that athlete needed to do at game speed, whether that was run a 40-yard dash for the NFL Combine or go out and run, 70 snaps as a wide receiver. We built a nice little meshwork there where we felt like we recovered it from the short to long and the long to short. I'm afraid, though, if we don't do the long to short, we're not getting those micro repetitions on tissues like the hamstring. And I think that's something where we may be missing the boat if all we do is take that short to long approach, because we're not getting those developmental reps, that grout work that I think is important. The challenge I have with that is sometimes that extensive and intensive tempo work is not done at the volumes or the amplitudes kinematically. It's the kinematics are different. And so that's my only concern, is that when we run 300s, you go take a bunch of fast dudes out and run 300s. The kinematics that they throw down for those 300s are not the same amplitudes that they're going to throw down when they get on those fly 20s or those fly 10s. And so I started to worry about that as a practitioner. And so we started to do and adopt and had some success with was, even though we're going to go out and run repeat, 110s, 220s, whatever, with our NFL guys, we were going to mandate that they adopt those maximum velocity kinematics while they're doing it. So we were dogmatic about, hey, we're going to coach those. We're not just going to let them run on a stopwatch. We're going to actually coach those reps as if they're doing technical speed work. And so we were mandating some of the same top end mechanics, the minimizing the backside mechanics, optimizing the front side mechanics, working on that stepping over the cycling of the leg. We were coaching that during conditioning. And that's where we really got the biggest bang for buck, because we were actually mandating great technique at submaximal intensities for those bigger volumes. Now that should sound familiar, right? Don't we do that in the weight room? Don't we coach our butts off for a set of 10 on squats, or do we just let them squat however they want for 10? We only coach when they do the 1s and the 2s? No, man, we're in there coaching technique. Why do we do that? I think it's a lot of the same reasons. And I think that's what we saw, is we're going to now coach kinematics in our conditioning with that long to short. And that really is where the sweet spot started to show up, is that we were actually getting really cool results with intensive tempo work on some of these fast guys. They were more tolerant of the sprint training, but they were also developing some of those speed endurance things that are going to be so important for them metabolically in their sport. So, God, that was 20 minutes worth of me talking about that. I don't know what you guys think of that. It was all a bunch of crap, but I'm curious. Throw a rock at me. Tell me that long to short's wrong, because you got to prove me wrong on that one, because I've just seen the benefits of it so much, and also the risk of not doing some level of long to short. I think it's setting ourselves up for some of those hamstring problems we're seeing.
Yeah, Lance, I don't think we can. I can tell you, going back 20 plus years of preparing guys for the NFL Combine, I remember when I first started hearing about the Michael Johnson Performance Institute, and you hear the name and you're like, well, are guys going to be fast because they went to Michael Johnson, or are they doing something there that's going to create some sort of results that, because we all know a gold medalist,
shoes, man. Yeah.
Yeah. So what, I've got a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to boil them down. So what did you learn from Michael Johnson that you were able to apply that allowed the Michael Johnson trained athlete to perform so well at the Combine? I would love for you to talk about that, and then eventually get into some of the start mechanics, and that may be later in this show, but I'm always fascinated by that. However you want to attack that.
And Michael was a great champion in sport, and was also a champion in business. I mean, I'm really proud and honored to have been a friend and partner of his for those 15 years at MJP, and building that business up from scratch, and having the success that we had. And we had some failures too. I mean, we, just as you said, we learned a lot of valuable lessons along the way. But what I can tell you about Michael that I learned right away was the value of some of the things that I learned as an athlete the hard way. Consistency was one. I mean, that's something you may not remember about Michael was his consistency. He didn't run fast just one time. He didn't just flash in the pan in Atlanta and have this great games. He kept winning gold medals all the time. And then he had like 0 silvers and 0 bronzes. I mean, this guy was the model of consistency. And I think that is the greatness for Michael is he's consistent. He is methodical in his approach to business as well as his approach to training. And that's something we adopted straight away at MJP was that we're going to be consistent. We're not going to be a flash in the pan. We're not going to be a dry erase board WAD approach. Kind of let's just see what it feels like today and use the old it depends kind of concept that's very in vogue right now. Well, what are we going to do today? Well, it depends. No, it doesn't, guys. I mean, that's something I did learn from Michael is, hey, he would talk about being in the green room before major events and getting ready to go out there on the track. And he said, he would basically win the race in the green room. And I was like, how do you do that? And he said, I'm looking around at these guys that we're getting ready to line up in. And they're all looking at each other like, who's going to get second place? Because that dude over there, I know he didn't skip that Tuesday that I skipped, because it was, New Year's Eve or whatever. And I decided to take that day off, or I was a little bit sore. So I took a few less reps on that Thursday after those repeat 300s. I know that dude over there didn't. And that level of confidence that he has going into competition because of his consistency was a competitive advantage. And we leveraged that at MJP all the time. We were also known for working. I mean, we weren't Club Med, we worked. And so we weren't for everybody. There were some players that came to us and are like, oh, I don't know if I want to go there. That place, they work there. I'd rather go somewhere where they, maybe massage you a little bit more or only train 2 or 3 days a week and spend the other days at the beach or something. Man, that's all we knew how to do was just train and be consistent with that training. So that's what I learned from Michael, sort of big picture. What I also learned from Michael that was more squeezed into what you're talking about with speed was that not everybody's going to run the same way. He had a funny style. You guys ever watch Michael run? If, some of your younger viewers need to pull up some old videos. He doesn't fit in the box of, optimum speed mechanics by defined, however we define that today, but kinematically, he looked kind of funky. And one of the things that he talked about was an advantage for him was finding Clyde Hart at Baylor. And Clyde was his coach, longtime coach. And he ended up there. One of the reasons, amongst others, is that Clyde wasn't going to mess with his style of running. It was good. Don't mess him up. The guy is amazing coming in the door. You don't want to mess him up. Or maybe some other coach might want to come in and try to tweak his technique or kind of try to think about optimizing here, there, or otherwise. They left him alone and they trained him to have this unbelievable speed endurance. And that's something that he already had a good amount of speed coming in the door at Baylor. And so they didn't try to mess with him and try to change up any of that technique. The kinematics were working for him because the outputs, the kinetics of what he was doing was world-class. And so don't mess him up. And, but then also take that speed and extend that speed. And so he was so consistent with that methodology that we just bought into that and ground that year after year after year with the folks that came and trained with us. And because it just wasn't going to work for us anyway in our system to do it any other way. Now, would we come in and, hey, let's adapt this to kind of best fit your style of running. Maybe we need to do a little bit more of this, or look for an area of opportunity or weakness and level that up. That's something else that Michael taught us, is that don't keep weaknesses from people. Let them know. We need to identify those weaknesses. And he was always big and tell me where my weaknesses are. If it's a lateral hip strength thing and you embarrass me on a manual muscle test, I want to know that sucks. You need to tell me that sucks. His mentality of a champion was, I want to know my blind spots. And that's where, I'll be honest, that's where you kind of got to filter that as a sports scientist or a physical therapist or whatever you call yourself. Some athletes, a lot of them, to be honest, aren't ready to hear it like that. Michael was this great white shark champion. Tell me exactly what's going on so I can fix it. I learned the hard way that you can't come at all your athletes with that data in that same way. You have you have to make sure that you meet them where they are with the message that you're trying to send them, which is, hey, this is instead of a weakness, instead of it, hey, Michael, your lateral hip strength sucks. It's terrible. You're going to probably pull a hamstring or, blow out a metatarsal if you continue to run with this lacking hip strength. Although he might be good with that information taken like that, and that might help him, motivate him, grab a hold of that concept. Others, you might need to package that in a different way. Hey, this is not a weakness. This is an opportunity. This is an area for you that potentially could hold a few tenths of a second in that 100-meter dash. Is that something you're interested in going after and getting? And so it taught me that not everybody's like Michael. And I think it helped me to, as a scientist, a sports scientist, to package that information in a way to get it, where it's palatable for the end consumer to take in and leverage, because we all want to help the end consumer. And sometimes some people want a carrot and some people want a stick. And I think figuring out your audience and figuring out how best to communicate some of those findings to help them realize their potential for speed was something Michael taught me. So that was 3 things. I don't know if that was enough, but I could go on and on about the things I learned from Michael and Coach Hart and dealing with some of the athletes that we got to hang out with. Is that something, Coach Reimer, I'm asking you now? What are your thoughts on that concept of taking information? Because I don't know, man. I still get it wrong sometimes. How do you take that information and deliver it in a way that's palatable and not negative, not distracting, not deflating for the athletes? Because I'm sure you bring some not bad news, maybe some areas of opportunity, or however you package that. How do you walk that line? How do you do that? Because that's got to be individualized for everybody, right?
Absolutely. I mean, how you communicate information to an audience depends on the audience or the consumer of that information. And I think it takes a lot of practice, a lot of art, and making a lot of mistakes along the way, and understanding, like, I showed this to someone and they didn't accept it. And I showed this to someone and it was really well received, and you get better and better at that. And sometimes it's just a conversation. Sometimes it does require graphics. Sometimes it requires a piece of paper with some bullets. There's a lot of different ways, but then what you're trying to communicate is you're trying to communicate information that can then elicit action. What's the action that's going to come from this? What's the intervention that's going to come from it? And we're constantly brainstorming how to do that. Like a recent strategy that we have proposed and believe we will roll out here at U of L, in particular with our basketball team, is when we do the physical profile, we put it in front of the athlete without telling the athlete what the strengths and weaknesses are. And on that dashboard, we have when you look at this, if we've done a good job telling the story visually, the athlete should see what they're good at. They should see what they could improve at. And sometimes instead of the words being ours, we let the words be theirs. And so what are 3 things that you feel you're really strong at? What are 3 things you feel you can improve at? And they look at it and go, I think I should improve in this, this, and this. And we agree with you. So is that what you want to focus on? Yeah, that's what I want to focus on. So let's focus on that. So sometimes you don't have to tell someone what their strengths and weaknesses are. You can facilitate an opportunity to let them tell you.
How do they do that? How do you set up the context for them, though? Like, I'm an athlete, you've done a motion analysis with me, and here you go. Here's your motion analysis, Lance. How do you communicate to me so I have some context? Because I'm not a physical therapist. I don't know what a 17 out of 21 on an FMS score means. Nobody, to be honest, nobody except the people listening on this podcast even care what 17 out of 21 on an FMS means, right? The athletes certainly don't, for the most part. How do you create that context for me to know as an athlete that that's an area of opportunity for me?
Right. So we have to put it in terms of scales that everyone understands, right? I think an A, B, C, D, F scale is probably not the best, but everyone understands like a 0 to 100 scale, right? People understand those types of things. And when I'm referring to our percentiles, being able to express information relative to some other comparative group that you would be a part of. That might be your team. That might be greater amounts of data that we've been able to collect that you might be a part of. In the particular case I was describing, we're using NBA combine data. So there's about, over 20 years of data there. And we try to narrow the players down to the top 20 players who have the same body dimensions as that player, similar playing positions. We filter the data until we get to a minimum of 20, right around 20 to 25, because you're not going to change body dimensions, but we can change the physical attributes through training and adaptation. So we say, according to the 20 to 25 players that your body resembles the most and play similar positions as you, this is how you rate in these different categories on a scale of 0 to 100. And that makes sense. And we put each of the categories on that scale, and they can see which ones are tall, closer to 100, and they can see which ones are short. And what are your strengths? What do you think you could improve upon? And let them tell you. They may not see their weaknesses like you do, but if they acknowledge what their weaknesses are, I think now you've kind of have almost a verbal contract on what we're going to work on.
I like it. Pat, I mean, like, and Teddy, jump in. Now I'm turning into being the interviewer because I'm curious on this one. I'm playing the devil's advocate here. What if I came out and challenged you and said, all that stuff you just told me you're measuring, whatever, jump height and angular momentum of whatever, blah, 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 crap that you're measuring, great. I play basketball or I play soccer. That's what's important. How much of that transfers? Tell me why I should care about that. How do I connect that to what's important to me? Because jumping and running and lifting weights, I don't like it. I don't see the connection to that. How are you going to make that important to me? I play soccer. Show me the transfer of what you think you're doing to what's helping me on the pitch. Go.
I want to hear Ted's answer.
I'm going to take notes because I get that question all the time.
Well, I will say this, at least in the world of football, is that there's minimal cutoffs of various tests that this is going to inhibit you from making income in the future. This is the minimal that they're looking at. We're not saying that you have to be the best in this area, but these are the minimal cutoffs, and it's based off historical data. And the other thing I try to convey to the athletes, when you present all the physical assessments, is I always try to find quotes from scouts about that individual that are negative. Because, if they're in college, they've had their ass kissed, coming out of high school into college. Now they're going to start hearing stuff that's bad about them, for the simple fact is we don't want to pay you more than we have to pay you. So we're going to tell you why you're not that good. So I tell, I'll get all these quotes from pro scouts and tell them to the athletes. And I go, now this isn't me saying it. I go, this is what, people are looked at. Your testing's just average. You play great against bad competition. You sort of go in a shell when you play against great competition. So how are you going to answer that when you have an interview with the team? So once again, I'm going to interview you. What's your response? Why is this consistently over the last 3 years you've played? Why do you respond in situations like that? We noticed over the last year that your body weight, body fat's up, by 8 pounds. What's the reason for that? So I think sometimes when we do assessments and they're not where we should be, I try to always look at it from a perspective. They're going on a job interview to be a professional in their sport. They have to answer the question.
Yeah, I like it. And that's, I think, kind of tongue firmly in cheek. I believe that what we do transfers to the field, but I don't know, guys. I mean, Ernie, you tell me, don't we kind of need some more data to show really that what we're doing is mattering on the pitch or on the field? I think it's been sort of this assumption, I feel like after 30 years that we've sort of stopped confirming that there's transfer, that, a bench press of, if you're an outside linebacker and your bench isn't, whatever, 405, then, that's the stop position there that you're not going to get on the field, or that you're not going to be able to tolerate an NFL game. I mean, have we done enough there to really prove
don't
that
think we
out or
have.
to sell to these athletes? Because they're asking the questions, guys. They're asking really good questions of us right now. And I'm not sure we have all those answers ready to go.
So the first thing on transfer, I mean, we know that transfer coefficients between your different physical virtues don't transfer very well into on-field sports performance. So there is some validity to the argument. So one thing, I'll share an anecdote on your question. An athlete comes, says like, I don't want to do all this. Like, how does this benefit me? This is what I do. This is the type of athlete that I am. And so I had an experience with an elite alpine skier that I was working with. She was on the World Cup team. She eventually competed in the Olympics, and the same thing. We're rolling out this off-season training block. We have all these manuals. It's pretty sophisticated. And during one-on-one meeting, she craps all over it. So when you have the time to have that conversation, what I did in that moment was I took it away from her. I said, okay, why don't you, like, you have to do something to prepare. So why don't you design your own plan and show it to me and show me what you're going to do to prepare? So she accepted the challenge, and in the end, then she realized she wanted help, and she ended up kind of doing something that was pretty close to what we were going to do. But what came from that was this idea that, sometimes the science informs us and eventually influences how we think, but how we think and our biases and our assumptions is what we truly act on and we live on. The things we see and the things we experience every day are the things we actually act on and go by. So working with our performance psychologist, what I started to do was I started to do some lesson plans to help the athletes wrap their minds around why these physical virtues were important for their sport. So one of the cool lesson plans we did was we created a series of case studies, all women's Alpine World Cup athletes. And we talked about what their virtues and their habits were, their attitudes were. And it was really a culmination. It took a lot of work to put these case studies together because it was real factual pieces of individual athletes from the past who didn't make it. They were cut from the team, or they just never made it at the World Cup level. So we were taking pieces together to build case studies. And then to get the World Cup, the elite team to come in, we had a new development team. They're all 15 and 16, and they're coming in for the first time. We're going to present these case studies. And I tricked the elite World Cup team, 6 of them all ranked top 30 in the world. I tricked them to join because I just said, I just need you there to support buy-in from these young athletes. And they're like, fine, Ernie, we'll go through this. But it was really for them. And in the end, they're like, you son of a bitch, you tricked us. They're like, but that was really good. So we had them, the World Cup athletes, working with the young athletes, going through these case studies, evaluating and analyzing what the limitations and the strengths were in the athlete, and going, what could this athlete have done better to be a great athlete and reach the highest level? So now it's not scientific, but what we're doing is we're shaping their thoughts and their biases and their assumptions, and we're changing the way they think. And now they're like, okay, we're bought in. We want to do this. So on the second question you asked, sorry to take up the mic, but you asked, like, do we have enough evidence? So one thing that I've been looking at lately is the relationship between sprinting or sprint performance and sport performance. And when you look at the peer-reviewed literature, say in the last 20 years, most of the research in the peer-reviewed literature will simply like correlate a time in a sprint, like a 20 or a 40. It's a sprint time, maybe average velocity, but they're just looking at these sprint times and trying to correlate that with sports performance. And in those correlational studies, the correlations are really, really low. But the reality is, in sprint training, we're collecting so many more data points, but yet in the science, we're just looking at sprint time or splits, right? It's so fascinating. But here's the thing. When you watch sport, you see people run in circles around others. Every fan, every athlete, every coach knows that sprinting is important. Science just hasn't really discovered the extent, just how much it is.
I think, Lance, the other thing is, when you get the athlete that questions all this, a lot of this stuff's BS. For certain sports, you don't have to be a freak athlete. And what always comes to mind is Tom Brady's combine performance. So when you watch that, but he's such an outlier in other aspects that are important for his particular position that you go, well, look at, Tom Brady didn't, have to run a 4.5 and didn't do this. And you're going, he hit some of the minimal standards for his position, but he's an outlier on some of these other variables related to his particular sport and position.
I know. I'm sitting here trying to ask questions like my 15-year-old son asked me. He asked me those kind of questions, right? I mean, he's 15, he plays soccer, and he's looking at me like, bro, you ain't got much evidence to support what you're selling out there. And I'm like, what are you talking about? This is 30 years for me. And I get all egotistical and upset, and all of a sudden then I'm looking around going, you know what? He's the consumer. And what I say, the consumer is always right. They are right. I think we've got a long way to go in that space. And then we got to translate it in something that makes sense to them, right? That's important to them. And that's where, Coach Ivey and I, we talked about it, I think in the other podcast around the above the neck stuff. What's the psychobiology and the neuroscience around that piece of it? There's only 2 chapters in the latest sports science manual out of 31 on psychobiology and neuroscience. 2 out of 31. That's like 6% of the content. Yet, I got to be honest with you guys. I think this is where we may need to focus our sports science going forward, is not all the other stuff, load monitoring and sprint profiling. And no offense, guys, that's great. I love talking that stuff. But if we can't connect it to this, if we can't sell it and package it and motivate with it and coach with it, dude, what are we doing? We're just talking to each other. We're going to conferences and talking to each other about the other 29 chapters.
Let me go there for a second, Lance, because we're talking about motivation. We're talking about, and it's good to have some extrinsic motivation. Like, I don't want to get embarrassed, or I don't want my coach to yell at me, or I don't want to run extra sprints because I'm out of shape, or I don't want to ride the bench. Those things are good. But then we also need to understand the internal, intrinsic, the approach motivation. What is it in it for? What's in it for the athletes? How can we help them to want it? The best I've seen both ends of those continuums work was with Coach Gary Pinkel, Hall of Fame coach, getting inducted to the Hall of Fame in December. He had in each one of his assistant coaches' offices all of these things that we were measuring by their position. So the standards for that position, looking at the conference. So every time an athlete set a PR, which was part of their intrinsic, extrinsic motivation to perform and do better, they would have to go up to the coach's office and change that PR. If they had a 34-inch vertical and they jumped 34.5, they went up there and they crossed it off in the position coach's office. But in that office, they got to see where their position, everyone was lined up. It wasn't hidden from anyone. So they could see, okay, well, if John and Joe are the 2 starters and they run this fast, they're this strong, and they're this explosive, and they're this agile, and then they could kind of measure up and then look at where they ranked in that conference. So that's the part of the motivation. But there's more to it than that. And we had questions when Dr. Brian Mann was on our staff. We're like, what's the point of doing all of this testing? Like, what correlates? Like, what's actually, so he looked at, okay, well, let me see if I can find some predictors of who's going to end up being a starter.
There you go.
And so we started looking at that, and he looked at the agility test and the jumps test and looked to see if we could find something. And he found something. He also found that we were doing too much max hang cleaning. So over a certain period, it was not having a carryover or a direct positive impact to other testing. So that's when we learned, okay, here's where the cutoff should be. And if they get this strong, then let's move them to velocity-based training. And then we found the ability to continue to be more explosive by switching to that testing. But that's where science comes in. You got to have questions. Dr. Reimer talks about that all the time. Studying sport, you got to have questions. And where do you get the questions from? From the athletes and the practitioners. And when you can go about it that way, then you can tell your athletes and coaches, okay, these are the tests we're doing. This is why. Here's the result. This is how it impacts and transfers to sport. So,
Love it.
Yeah,
love it. No, again, it's some of that's tongue in cheek, but some of it's my frustrations is that we have a lot, I think, left to unpack. And I love what you said about, correlating or relating the testing that we do that shows the wares of our work and hard work and why it's important to get in the weight room or get in the recovery tanks or whatever, and begin to overlap that with, your chance of starting, the risk of the health issues, the wins and losses as a team. I think there's some value there, is sort of trunching all that together and saying, hey, look, as a team, when we have this sort of metric here, and here, historically, we've played more games into the fourth quarter close, or we've won more. I think those are all, I think the athletes that I'm dealing with day to day already here at Oklahoma State, that's the kind of information that has some gravity for them, that really tugs on them, versus coming at them with the same old message. And these guys and gals, they've lifted weights and ran and tested, and they've been doing that since they were knee high to a grasshopper, right? They're used to that stuff. But to be able to come in with that level of connectivity to the science with the practice, with the actual, where the rubber meets the road, that's important to them, which is on the pitch, on the field, on the court, linking that up. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done there. But to your point, I think there's ways to do that, and there's ways to do that right. And I just encourage everybody that's listening, I'm encouraging myself by saying this, is let's make sure we focus on that bit a bit more than the box plots and the trend lines and the athlete management systems for all the data and all the stuff that we all geek out about. I think we all need to get a little more geeked out about the above the neck thing, which I know you're very passionate about. And at some point, need to tell your story about why you dedicated such a big chunk of your life into that space, coming from where you came, which was the strength conditioning realm. So anyway, I appreciate your comments on that.
With regard to that, Lance, you were over in Barcelona recently, worked with, professional soccer, and from the neck up, you're dealing with, pro soccer, a lot of other different professional sports. Have you found that you have to use different cues or strategies when working with different professional sports?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think different sports require different cueing. I think as a good coach, we always our words matter, and I have a tendency to have verbal diarrhea. I've learned that. I encourage you guys to videotape yourself sometimes coaching. It's amazing. It's debilitating if you watch yourself coach. I mean, it's just so embarrassing. I still try to do it, but I talk too much. I give too much information, and I turn little snippets of information into lectures. And so over the last 30 years, I've learned how not to provide coaching cues and motivational things that I think is helpful across the board. So hard stop there. Athletes want less words. I mean, I'll start there. Whether they're professional, elite, or they're my 15-year-old, they don't really care about the lecture, and they don't care about they really don't. In fact, it's almost annoying to them when you start going into a diatribe about why their shin bone needs to be here when they contact the ground, and how that's going to relate to more vertical force when they go at max. They don't care. They really don't. Give them one cue. And the really good coaches, and I've seen this, you mentioned soccer. I was at Real Madrid recently working with them for about 10 days. And what I noticed there was the same thing I noticed with some of the best coaches, whether it was the Dallas Cowboys or University of Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, whatever. It's the same thing you guys probably see, is the really great coaches, whether they're strength conditioning coaches or position coaches, athletic trainers, physios, they can say more with less. I mean, they can drop one or two words or one or two cues and instantly and rely on that awkward silence moment, do this, and then long silence, and not fill that up with a bunch of diarrhea, letting them kind of absorb that. And I've seen that, you've probably seen that as well. I've seen that across all different sports as being consistent. The really good ones say less. So I got a long way to go. But they're able to really be surgical with their choice of words and their choice of cues. And over at the professional soccer at Real Madrid, one of the things that comes to mind is this concept of internal versus external cues. So I was working with a group on some maximum velocity mechanics. And I was, Gabriel Wolf and others have opened our minds up, Coach Winkleman as well. They've done a great job of opening our minds up to this concept of different types of cues, right? Different ways of conveying the information to get a change in behavior that you're looking for. And the hot stuff right now is these external cues, right? So let's cue somebody externally to get them to get their knee higher when they run. So instead of telling them, you need to get your knee up when you run, you want to step over the tall grass, or some sort of external cue, right? That helps them to assimilate what it is you're trying to get them to do. And what I have found, interestingly enough, in dealing with elite athletes, very highly elite athletes, the internal cue of just telling them to get their knee up actually works better than the external cue. Now, I don't know why, but when I try to get too cute with my external cues, the high end elite, they typically do a lot better with the internal cues. Now, I don't know if there's some science, Pat, you're nodding your head. Yes, maybe there's already science that's supporting that. I've seen that anecdotally where I've had to scrap the whole concept of the whole external cue thing and just tell them what I want from them. Now, the less elite, the ones that are just trying to figure it out, the external cue seems to work better in that example. And so regardless of sport, now I don't know why that is. I really don't. And it may just be a small enough sample size that I'm talking out of my butt on that. But I do think there's something to that concept of, depending upon their sport, maybe potentially depending upon their level of athleticism or their level of mastery of that thing, that you may need to figure out whether to use the internal cue or the external cue early on, because you might not have another chance with them. And that's the other thing if I come at them with an external cue and they're like, there's that verbal diarrhea, they're only going to give me about 4 or 5 seconds the next time I come with a cue. So I better come with the right one, because if I spit another, external cue at somebody and it falls flat, I might have lost them for the whole session. And so that's something I have learned, is that say more with less, and that forces you to be a little bit more surgical and strategic with your cueing, so that you're not verbally, hitting them with verbal diarrhea all the time. That the analogy I'd use in that case is also in the physical therapy world. So as a physical therapist, if I'm out there treating patients, I used to think that the more treatment I gave them, the more stuff I threw at the problem, the better I would come off as a physical therapist, right? So Pat comes to me and he's got knee pain. Or, okay, great. I've got a bazillion things I can do for Pat. I've got this cool exercise and that one. I've got the decline this, and I've got the VBT that, and I'm going to throw the kitchen sink at Pat because I'm the genius when it comes to knee pain. If Pat is an elite athlete, he doesn't value, my experience, he doesn't value that as much as if I would have come to Pat with the 1 or 2 things that was the key unlocks for him to do to get rid of that knee pain. It's almost like I would lose Pat as an elite. If he's an elite performer, I would lose his confidence in me by coming at him with everything I know to do about this knee pain, versus coming at him with the 1 or 2 things that are the key unlocks for Pat. It's a level of mastery that he's basically requiring of me to imbibe his trust in me, is how well I'm able to procure from all the noise the 1 or 2 things that's really going to be a key unlock for Pat. Elite athletes, what I've seen, they look for that as a sign of credibility and a sign of developing trust. So I don't know if that's analogous to what we're talking about here, but I've absolutely learned that, and it's been a really consistent finder for me, and something I pass on to young therapists all the time in the physical therapy world. And I learned that from Gray Cook. Gray Cook, the father of functional movement screening and corrective exercises. I came to Gray Cook, it feels like 100 years ago, and asked him, I said, hey, what if I've got this, thing that I need to work on, and I got all these exercises to do, which one's most important to do? And he said, well, weird. Give me the list of things you do in this problem. And I'd give him, these 12 things. He goes, that looks great. They're all applicable. I'm sure they'll all have a place here. Cut that list in half and come back to me. I'd be like, oh, shoot. That's hard to do, right? So I'd go back and cross this out, modify this, whatever, and I'd come back after an hour and, okay, Gray, here's my list of 6. And you know what that sucker did? Cut it in half again. Now, think about that as a practitioner. That really forces you to really get down and dirty with yourself. And do I really know of this laundry list of stuff, what's really going to be effectual? What's the real unlock? What's the bold? What's the signal in the noise? And I think that's something for us in dealing with athletes that I've learned is get down to that position where you know what the bolded ones are. Of that 12, you know what the important ones are, and then you know the key locks that need to be picked inside of that list of 12, because that's probably where you're going to need to hang your hat on your treatment or on your training or whatever. And by doing so, and if you can unlock that in that athlete with only 2 things instead of 12, you gain tremendous amount of credibility. And oh, by the way, you save a lot of time, energy, and other resources that may be spent doing something else. I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody. Pat was nodding his head.
No,
I don't know, Pat, if that makes sense in terms of the confidence, psychobiology side of things, but I've seen that with elite athletes that it's important to share here, I think.
If I answer that, then I'm going to close. That's going to close the show out because we'll be out of time. So is that what you want me to do? Or do you want to
I don't
go
know
in?
if there's an answer to that. That's probably that encapsulates everything we've talked about today. And I hope I didn't come across negatively. I come across as excited. I've been here 30 years, been doing, I hope to do it another 30 years. But I'm excited about the future because there's so many of these question marks. And that should excite people. I hope it doesn't cut people's, confidence to the quick. It does the opposite. It spurs in all of us that little scientist that says, let's go find those answers. Let's be okay with asking those tough questions. And some of it today was tongue in cheek, but a lot of it was me asking those same questions of myself. That gets me up, gets me excited. And I love talking to you guys about it. So maybe 30 more years from now, we'll come back and have answers to those questions. I'm not expecting you to have them because I don't think they exist.
That's awesome. I am going to throw something at our listeners just to add to the conversation, and then kick it back to you, Lance, and then you give us some final thoughts, and then tell our listeners how they can reach out to you. I would encourage people to look up DC and Ryan's self-determination theory. And what that is, the self-determination theory is competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And if your athletes can have those components, then they'll be self-determined. They'll be self-motivated. So when you talked about those elite athletes, they're probably very self-determined, self-starters. When you can give them 1 or 2 cues, that pours into that competence bucket. You got the relatedness bucket because you got the relationship with them. And if you can give them a choice of which goes back to Dr. Reimer's points, if you can give athletes a choice in the right things, then that fills up that self-determination as well by filling up one of those buckets. So look up DC and Ryan self-determination theory. It leads to intrinsic motivation. And kick it back to you, Lance. Close us out.
That's amazing. Well, I appreciate it, and I appreciate this profession. It's been very good to me. I'm committed now to not just being the guy that looks for the problems. Any idiot can look outside and tell you it's raining, right? The village idiot can do that. And I've been the village idiot for a long time. It's time for me to put my money where my mouth is. And in my next 30 years, God willing, it's all about finding solutions. And so I think we've identified a lot of problems in this space. There's a lot of negativity in this space that's out there around those problems. I just encourage everybody to keep looking at things as opportunities. They're problems, but they're opportunities. Sounds cliche, but hopefully I've motivated some of us that are listening. I know I've remotivated myself in talking with you guys to go out and find solutions, because their solutions are out there. And when we keep that athlete in the center of it, they deserve our best, not just good enough. And so I'm committed to that. I know you guys and your listeners are as well. So I appreciate you guys very much.
Lance, one last thing. Could you recommend a couple books for our listeners?
Oh my goodness. I've been studying a lot. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of good things that have been kicked around on the podcast already. And I've picked up on several of them. The self-determination theory was a new one. I appreciate that, Pat. I'm going to be doing a dig on that. And I'm going to be weird here. I've been studying Aristotle lately. And that seems kind of weird, I know, for us on a strength conditioning, sports science type podcast to talk about Aristotle. But Aristotle, and if that's too archaic for you, pull on up to Peter Drucker or Roger Martin. And what they talk about as thinkers is thinking strategically. And I really think as a profession, we can all learn from being more strategic in our thinking, making choices, making the right choices, winning aspirations, et cetera. And so I encourage listeners to get out of the space that you're in. I mean, that's what I can say is don't read the next greatest, if you're a sports science person, sports science text, or you're a speed guy, you want to read the next great speed book. I'll encourage you at this point to get out of that comfort zone and search in other areas, because I promise you it's going to add some context and some extra color to what you're already doing in ways that you can't even imagine. So pick up something from Aristotle. It may be in Sanskrit. I may be in black and white. You may have to go to the old library and print it off on a photocopier. I don't know where you're going to get that stuff, but pick up some Aristotle, pick up some Drucker, maybe even some Roger Martin, and look into strategic thinking. I think it'll help you.
Well, Lance, appreciate that. And as far as how people can reach you, Lance Walker.
Lance.Walker 8585@gmail.com, or just follow me on Twitter and DM me there. I don't have enough Twitter followers, for crying out loud. It's at the Beta Rock. Reach out to me there, and I'll try to be a little more entertaining on the Twitter sphere in the future. So I promise I'll be a better follow in the next 30 days. How about that?
There you go. We appreciate you. We thank you. Thank you for your time, Dr. Reimer, Dr. Lambrinidis. Y'all have a great night.
Awesome.
Take
Thanks,
care.
guys.
Appreciate it.